these peptides that are classified for research purposes only. And this is really important. Mike, how much research has been conducted on what these research only peptides do inside the human body?
Well, it depends on the peptide itself that we're talking about. Some of these have zero research as it relates to safety. I mean, zero. And someone would say, well, why? Like, how is this stuff even available? Why would anybody even inject it in themselves? Like, doesn't even make any sense. Like, how could anybody inject something in their body that has zero safety studies as it relates to humans consuming it?
Hey everyone, this is Dr. Taryn Marie and Mike Alden from the Better Body Lab podcast, and we've got a special episode for you today where we're going to talk about peptides. And if you've been following along with what's happening in the news and with the FDA and with RFK, you may have noticed that there's a lot of conversation about whether or not research peptides are going to be legalized and what that would mean. And so Mike and I wanted to come to you to bring you a sense of how can you think about what peptides are? Maybe you don't even know what a peptide is. And so we can talk to you about what a peptide is and what this might mean for building a better body, a better mind, and a better life. And fortunately, Mike is our resident peptide expert, both in terms of understanding a great deal about peptides themselves. We both have a peptide stack that we use, and he's studied carefully the legal landscape of what might happen in the future. So, Mike, so excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you. I don't know that I'm a peptide expert, but
Don't
I
ju-
happen to,
don't discredit yourself.
yeah, I think you do a better job of explaining what peptides are. But I certainly have been in this, health and wellness space, dietary supplement space, nutraceutical space, as people like that made up word, for a long time, and certainly been interested in it my pretty much not only my entire career, but my entire life. So it's a very interesting time right now for the world of peptides.
I
Absolutely.
think so. All right, so why don't we start off with what a peptide is, and maybe I'll be the one to do that
You
explanation
do that.
really, yeah, in layman's terms. So, all right, so for those of you listening in, I want you to sort of like rewind back to your high school biology days, when you learned about nutrition and biology. And what we learned about were the building blocks of protein. And the building blocks of protein are amino acids. And as you remember, amino acids are made up of peptide chains. And so when we talk about a peptide, it is effectively a medication that has been created in a way that it is tied to a chain of peptides, which are the building blocks of amino acids and ultimately proteins. Something that a lot of people don't know is when we talk about weight loss medications like GLP-1s, the branded names for that are Ozempic, Manjaro, Wegovy, things like that. Those are peptides. That is a weight loss medication that has been built on a peptide chain. It has been legalized. It has been created by pharmaceutical manufacturers like Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. Also, what we call the non-branded GLP-1s by the name of semaglutide or semaglutide or tirzepatide or retatrutide. Those are all peptides too for weight loss. What we're going to be talking about today is a specific class of research peptides. And these are things that you may have heard about, like BPC 157, TB 500. There's a copper, it's called GHKCU. There's thousands of these kind of research peptides. And what's really fascinating is, and Mike, I want you to say more about this. We typically only have these peptides as a research only access, and they're not broadly legalized across the United States. They're not illegal, but they're also not legal. So, Mike, could you talk to us a little bit about kind of set the stage? What is happening in the world of research peptides right now that people might find fascinating and interesting? And what does that mean as we're kind of hearing about this idea of like legalization and availability?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really interesting time in the world of, health and wellness and taking on a real interest in your own personal health, right? Agency of your own personal health. And it's interesting to have someone like RFK, at the head of the HSS, whether or not you are a proponent of his or supporter of his, it doesn't really matter. What he is doing, and just like Trump as well, is really kind of disrupting the status quo, right? Right. Trump, obviously, politically and globally, and all these different things, where Kennedy is really taking aim at some of the things that he believes, whether he's right or wrong, are not good for the American public. Like taking dyes out of the food supply. One basic thing is, you look at Fruit Loops, right, here in the United States, or you look at Fruit Loops in Europe, and if you look at the list of the ingredients, call them ingredients loosely, in Fruit Loops here, there's probably 40 or 50 different ingredients, where in Europe or other parts of the world, there's like 10, right? And a lot of those things that are here in the United States are designed really to, maintain the shelf life of these products so they can sit on the shelves longer. And that also can go down an entire rabbit hole of government subsidies and how things are made and why they basically stockpile things. So a lot of preservatives and a lot of things that are in our food supply here in the United States just ultimately aren't good for us. So he is, kind of disrupting that world. So from food, and then, then they're taking aim at the pharmaceutical space, right? If you have seen Kennedy with his shirt off, because he likes to do, I mean, I think he's in his early 70s. He is very fit. He is certainly interested in this space and specifically peptides. In fact, he was just on Joe Rogan talking about peptides, and he talked about how he takes peptides himself and how he, experienced, benefits. So as you said, Taryn, there are thousands of these peptides. And, we know of, I don't know, probably if we sat down and worked really hard, we could probably write down maybe 50, maybe 100 together between the two of us. There are a lot of different peptides that are on the market, have been on the market for a long time, that help people. And the challenge that happens is you have government agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, which their, kind of main purpose really is to protect the American public, right? Their job is to make sure that the food and the drugs that are here in the United States are ultimately safe for us, right? And they have different processes by how they look at that. So a lot of the peptides that exist today, you had mentioned some of the branded drugs. Those drug companies go through years and years, sometimes decades, of research and billions of dollars of research. And there's really kind of a couple different ways they look at it. But, the two big ones is safety and efficacy. Is it going to be safe for you? Is it going to be efficacious? And when they look at safety, they also look at, the risk reward, right? Because there's always going to be some sort of contraindication to every sort of medication. So when they're making drugs and when the FDA approves drugs, they say, okay, does the reward outweigh the risk? And if it does, and it goes through the processes that it needs to go through the FDA, which sometimes again takes years of approval, then it becomes, a commercial drug. A lot of these peptides have not gone through that process. And that's where it's starting to become confusing for people, and what's next. There's a lot of talk right now because Joe Rogan was just excuse me, Kennedy was just on Joe Rogan, and he's talking about all these peptides, and he was saying that, hey, we really want to give people access to it, and that now has turned into what I would say complete chaos on the internet. in the United States saying that all these peptides are now going to be available, and that's just I don't believe that that's the case.
Which brings me to peptides. Like where are we at right now on peptides and getting them regulated and making sure it's not this weird gray area? Because we know they're effective.
What happened was there were 19 peptides that were widely formulated by compounding pharmacies during the Biden administration. They illegally moved those to category 2, which says do not formulate. What happened? There was huge demand for peptides. And so a black market came out. And a lot of this stuff that we've looked at is just, is very, very substandard. I'm very anxious to move, probably not all of those peptides, some of them are in litigation, but about 14 of them back to making them more accessible. Within a couple of weeks, we will have announced some kind of new action.
So, what do you think? What would be the circumstances under which some of these research peptides would become legal, if that's the right word, or more widely available? How would that work, do you think? And, what do you think the timeline for that would be?
Yeah, so if you go through now, I'm an attorney, not necessarily in this space, but I have grown up in the dietary supplement space, so there's a lot of kind of crossover there. When you're talking about prescriptions, it's a much more rigorous process, right? In all reality, as we sit here today, if there was we'll call it what they call a new dietary ingredient or a new drug application in the world of pharmaceuticals, it's years before it actually becomes available where the average everyday person could either get a prescription for it or they could somehow get access to it. It's years. And a lot of the peptides that people are interested in, like you had mentioned BPC 157, TB 500, you didn't say about CJC, there's AOD, GHK, there's a lot of these peptides that people are taking, including me, right, on a daily basis that people want access to. And what Kennedy is trying to do is he's trying to make it so that it's safer. And so generally, when a new drug is brought to market, it's years. And what Kennedy is trying to do is trying to effectively bypass the process in which the FDA has had in place, which I just don't think is possible. Hold on. It's not that it's not possible. I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think because
You don't think it's probable?
I don't think it's probable because the safety part of it, right? If there were 15 peptides that were just unilaterally allowed to be compounded, that's what he's talking about, overnight, right? And God forbid somebody gets sick and dies, right? Now we have a real problem. And I just don't see the FDA being pressured by Kennedy or anybody for that matter to allow that to happen. And you know what? As somebody who injects this stuff every day and who is a proponent of access and health and wellness, I believe that that's the right course of action. I believe that the FDA should take a little bit of time and not just say, okay, this stuff can be available to everybody.
Hmm. Now, when you listen to Joe Rogan or when you read some of the articles around RFK's thinking about research peptides, and again, research peptides are peptides that are for research purposes only. We're not talking about GLP-1s. We're not talking about weight loss drugs. We're not talking about approved. These very clearly on the bottle say for research only. And some of the ones that you mentioned, it sounds a lot like alphabet soup for people that are less familiar with this world, right? BPC 157, TB 500, AOD, right? But when you listen to RFK's argument, it sounds like he's got this thing handled. Like, there's a picture that I think is painted for me when I listen to him talk on an episode like Joe Rogan. So walk us through a little bit, like what is RFK's thinking and reasoning around how peptides could become fairly readily available in a way that the FDA might corroborate this?
Here's the biggest concern I think he has, and it's what he said, and it's the right place to start, right? One, he has personal experience of it, so if you have personal experience, you're going to probably be a little bit more passionate about it. But he is concerned about safety. So a lot of these peptides, and he did say this on Joe Rogan's show, and quite frankly, most pharmaceutical drugs, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, in other words, the base of a lot of these drugs, they're made outside of this country. They're made in China, they're made in India, right? They just are. And then when they come into this country, that's when things change, right? That's when different labs, third-party labs, drug manufacturers are testing it. They're running it through a battery of stability tests, sterility tests. They're making sure there's no endotoxins, no no heavy metals and things. They're just making sure that it's at least as pure as it possibly can be. So that's his first kind of, I believe, thought process. We want to make sure that the stuff that's coming into the United States is safe because when you have demand, there's going to be bad actors, right? So right now, with these research peptides, as you said, they're not illegal to possess. They're not even illegal to sell, right? But what becomes, quote, illegal is how they're sold. In other words, what they're saying about them. So a lot of bad actors out there are saying, hey, if you take this peptide and you have XYZ disease, it's going to be cured. That's when the FDA starts to get concerned. That's when the Federal Trade Commission starts to get concerned. That's when the different boards of pharmacies start to get concerned. And that, I believe, that's where Kennedy is starting. So I think one of the things that Kennedy is trying to do is like, hey, these manufacturers from outside the United States that are shipping straight into the United States into an average consumer's hands, that's what I want to stop. That's the one thing I think, where he's headed. And I think that can be done quick. That can be done pretty quickly, right? And so if I was a consumer right now and you're hearing about this, you're watching Joe Rogan, you listen to Joe Rogan, and maybe you heard about these things, or maybe you're on a podcast like ours, because we've had some people talk about this stuff. You and I have talked about this stuff before. And let's say you wanted to get it today. You're like, oh, BPC 157 sounds really interesting to me.
Mhm.
Well, there's a lot of things that the average consumer could do, but the biggest thing is trust, right? And how do you trust? How do you really know? How can you really trust these companies? Well, when you buy anything, even a dietary supplement or a lot of food sometimes as well, but it's usually a dietary supplement and certainly a drug, you can get what they call a certificate of analysis, right? And that certificate analysis is going to tell you all those things that I just mentioned, right? Ultimately, it's going to tell you whether or not it's pure, right? It'll tell you where it's made, and it'll tell you where it's processed. Now, that in and of itself isn't also the end all be all. If you really want to be safe, and there are companies out there, and Taryn, you and I met an old friend of yours that has another friend who has a company that does this. You can literally take the vial that you get. Like if you get something from a website and you want to try it, buy 3 vials, take one, send it to a third party lab, have them test it before you do anything with it. I think that's kind of like one of the safest things to do. But ultimately, to answer your question, what he's trying to do first, I think he's really trying to make the supply safe.
So that leads me to the next question, which is if, while these aren't legal, but it's not illegal to possess them, it's not even illegal to sell them. Um, is there a problem with accessibility, or what is RFK trying to address through his agenda of legalization when right now you can get these peptides, you can inject these peptides, and there is a level of access and affordability that exists today? What is he trying to influence here?
I think I think what he believes is that by controlling the base ingredient, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, starting there, and then allowing it to be compounded, made at, quote, reputable compound pharmacies, I believe that he believes that that will improve the safety for the average, consumer. So I think what he's trying to influence is he's trying to influence the FDA to have the FDA ultimately say that these are available to be compounded. The challenge, and Taryn, you and I talk about this all the time. I could go down a rabbit hole for a long period of time from a legal perspective. But the challenge with that is the speed in which that can be done, right? It just can't be done correctly within a couple weeks. Now we saw what happened with COVID and how things got sped up quickly. And lo and behold, guess what? There's all sorts of problems with vaccines that were rushed through. Shocker. Okay. So what I think ultimately his influence is going to do, which I think will be good for people, right, as long as they can educate themselves. What I think is going to happen is because the FDA does have a process, there are certain steps that just need to be followed, from safety to efficacy to animal trials to human trials. There's a lot of things that need to be done, and it just takes time. There are a bunch of peptides that do have history of use, right? They have history of safety. Most of it's anecdotal though, right? There's not actual human studies. There's just people have been using it for years. When I look at the dietary supplement space, a lot of dietary supplements are like that as well. They're just people have been taking them for years, right? So what I think is going to happen is the FDA is going to do something, it's called enforcement discretion. I think the FDA is probably going to issue some sort of letter, right? Or some sort of guidance and say, ultimately, we're not going to come after you, compound pharmacies, if you just do these things, right? If you just make sure that the active pharmaceutical ingredient is tested, that you make sure that you're not saying certain things, and that you're just giving some basic guidance. That in and of itself changes the way the FDA has operated since 1933, when I believe the FDA was actually, became an agency.
So let's back up for just a moment because you talked about animal models, you talked about human models, these peptides that are classified for research purposes only. And this is really important. Mike, how much research has been conducted on what these research only peptides do inside the human body?
Well, it depends on the peptide itself that we're talking about. Some of these have zero research as it relates to safety. I mean, zero. And someone would say, well, why? Like, how is this stuff even available? Why would anybody even inject it in themselves? Like, doesn't even make any sense. Like, how could anybody inject something in their body that has zero safety studies as it relates to humans consuming it? And I have the same question. Like, how is that even possible, right? Well, so it's possible because of what we call anecdotal data, right? Or also lack of what Kennedy said, lack of safety signals. In other words, there hasn't been any reports of what they call adverse events. So people are just putting it in their body, nobody's gotten sick, right? And so a lot of these research peptides are classified as research peptides because ultimately it's just a loophole. That's really what we're talking about, right? And I wanted to say one thing about research peptides. So you have what they call research grade material, right? It's a similar analysis or a similar way to look at it as pet food, right? Versus human grade food, right? A lot of the pet food is made with the same kind of base ingredients, chicken, beef, things like that. But a lot of the pet food is byproducts. It's stuff that humans wouldn't necessarily want to consume. And then human food is the actual chicken. It's not the bones. It's not it's not the fat. It's the actual meat itself, right? So you have that would be considered the pet food is research grade, right? And then you have research. There you have something that's classified as a research peptide. There's actually a small distinction there. Research grade and a research peptide. The second is just how companies are classifying it so they can get around some of the FDA regulations. It doesn't make it an inferior product. That's the difference. You could have a research peptide that is 99% pure, that has gone through all the safety and efficacy studies and research that we've just talked about. You could have a peptide that does that and still be considered a research peptide because it ultimately hasn't been approved by the FDA. So I think ultimately, what Kennedy is trying to do is trying to speed up the process to make some of these things easier. Ultimately, again, I think it's going to be enforcement discretion, and I think we're going to see a slow rollout. There's going to be some peptides that do, in fact, have clinical data, history of use, safety and efficacy studies on humans already that have been, banned, so to speak, that are going to be put back on. That's where I see things happening. I don't see some of these ones, even like the ones that we like, BPC or what have you, just unilaterally being able to be compounded without any sort of oversight.
Do we know what peptides have research and efficacy behind them?
Yeah, so there are some that have been like I believe CJC 1295 is one of them, or ipamorelin, I believe, kisapeptin, I think. Those three, I might be wrong on CJC, but ipamorelin and kisapeptin, I'm sure, have been used before, and then they were put into a category, which by the way doesn't exist anymore, what they call category two, which basically means you can't compound them, right? Because there were some safety issues. But both of those have been commercially available before. I believe that those two will probably get put back on and allowed to be compounded, and maybe just on some a much tighter safety protocol. Ipamorelin, I believe, was a drug, a commercial drug that was used to help with muscle wasting in HIV and AIDS patients, right? But then there were some safety issues, and so they put it back in category two. I think there's probably a way to tighten up the safety standards for it. In other words, making sure that the class of people that do take it fall within a certain category because of that whole risk reward, because there still is going to be a safety risk, and whether or not the reward outweighs the risk is something that a clinical provider slash doctor is going to have to determine.
Hmm. Um, okay, so really, sort of my last question, and bringing this down to the level of the consumer, to our audience, to our listeners, for folks that are listening to this right now that are like, okay, that's a really interesting analysis. Maybe I am taking some research peptides. Maybe I'm research peptide curious. Maybe I want to look more into this and think about what it can do for me or members of my family. How should I be thinking about this as a consumer? And what does sort of the potential existing legal landscape for me, what does that mean for me and my access?
So if you're curious, I mean, so here we are in early March. Pretty sure we're going to release this in March. So here we are in March of 2026. And if it's a little bit later, hopefully it's not, but it's March of 2026. I'd give it a little bit of time and just see what the FDA is going to do. I'm very confident that, again, could be wrong. Lawyers always give themselves a little out, but I'm very confident that the FDA is not just going to just wholesale say, here are all these peptides, go ahead and make them have at it. I don't think that's going to happen. That would just, again, it would completely change the entire landscape of the Food and Drug Administration. I think they're going to, again, exercise enforcement discretion, which means we're not going to do anything, right? So as a consumer, I give it a little bit of time. If you're really curious and you wanna try it, I think, look, you know this, right? So I inject research peptides every single day, not research grade, research peptides every single day. I give my father, research peptides, right? So I'm a believer in the safety and the efficacy of these things. And anecdotally, for me and for my father and for others that I know and love, it helps. It helps them. If if I were going to give anybody any sort of advice, and again, you have to be really careful. I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm not qualified to give you legal advice. So don't take this as any sort of legal or medical advice. But if I had a friend and they asked me, hey, I want to take this stuff, what should I do? Well, one, you find a company that maybe someone else that you know knows and likes and have had some success with it. I would start there, just like anything else, right? Two, I would look at the company and I would look at what sort of documentation do they have that can provide you with a level of comfort that the product itself is made at the highest standard possible here in the United States, right? It's made right here in the United States. It's tested right here in the United States. Then I would see whether or not it's been third party tested, right? So an independent third party company tests it, and you'd get that through what they call a certificate of analysis. That's a pretty high level of trust. Can that be manipulated? Yes, but that's okay. Let's assume that it's not, right? For that. And then the last thing I would do if you want to be ultimately safe for yourself, right, is if you're going to try something, again, I'm not a doctor. I'm, I can't give you medical advice, but I'm talking to you as if you're my friend. I would buy 3 bottles. I would take one. I would send it to an independent third-party lab, have it tested for all the things we just talked about, and then if you decide that you feel comfortable with it, then you can try and see if it works for you. That's how I would look at it as a consumer. I'm gonna say it one more time. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not giving any sort of medical advice. That's the lawyer in me,
or legal advice.
or legal advice. Sorry, I'm gonna have to write this up in disclaimers. And look, I know we don't have a lot of time, but as you and I both know, it's a really interesting time to be alive. It's a really interesting time to be in this space in health and longevity because as if you take a look at my Instagram, I talked about this. I am a proponent of, like, we're talking about this stuff. You're a proponent of this stuff. We see the benefits, right? And the reason why we have the Better Body Lab podcast is because we want to continue to give people the best information that we possibly can. And so there are some really, really great benefits to a lot of these things. And I hope that as the information continues to come out, that people educate themselves as best they can. And then ultimately they make the decision on their own for what's best for them. So.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we can put in the show notes also where we get our peptides and
Sure.
also suggest a company for third-party testing. We'll put that in there as well.
Yeah, we do. We definitely do know of some great companies. We'll probably give you a few that we feel really good about. And then that other company we talked about, they test this stuff,
Mhm.
So,
Great.
yeah, that's a great idea.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to the Better Body Lab podcast with Mike Alden and Dr. Taryn Marie. We're going to put in the show notes a couple of things just to help you kind of navigate this space, including where we get our peptides. Also, a company that you can send any peptides that you have or your family members have to get third-party testing to understand what is actually in that little vial. And thanks for tuning in today. We're excited to be on the forefront of this conversation. We really see a lot changing in this research peptides area, and we're excited to walk you through this, answer questions that you have, and provide guidance. Thanks, everyone. Until next time, this is the Better Body Lab podcast with Dr. Taryn Marie and Mike Alden.